Hello, my name is Spencer and welcome back to my hobby channel. I'm enjoying sharing, learning how to paint miniatures and make dioramas. This is a miniature from Bloodborne, the video game. This FromSoft boss is one of my friend's favorites and he asked me to paint up a miniature of it for him. However, I wanted to take it one step further and I wanted to use this box in order to make a small book nook for displaying the miniature. I ordered this model some time ago for this project, and it did come to me in a decent state of repair, but I have had it for a while, so I have broken a few things on it that will need to be repaired for this project. For example, this elbow I fixed with green stuff, one of the antlers is missing, and she is supposed to be holding a pendant in her hand. This boss, Vicar Amelia in the video game, is in a cathedral arena. So to create a cathedral for the book nook, I'm going to create some walls, some floor, and a roof to provide that effect. To begin with, I think I'd like to paint this box black because I think that'll save me many steps in the future. Next, we can move on to fixing up Vicar Amelia. To begin with, I'll create a green stuff pendant and the antler so that they can set for as long as they need to. Another thing that I noticed is that she is a rather hairy boss in the game, and this plastic doesn't give a great hairy texture, so I'd like to try to fix that as well. To create all the required modifications to the miniature, I'll be using Army Painter green stuff to mold it to the best of my ability. First, I'll trim off the existing antler so that I can create a more symmetrical pair of antlers later on. To use the green stuff, you take equal parts of the blue and the yellow and you knead it together until you get an even green coloration. Sometimes I did have some solid epoxy in it and I had to pick it out though. Once properly kneaded, we can then move to the assembly of the broken parts on the miniature. I chose to start with the amulet by using a smaller piece of the epoxy and I rolled it out to a thread's length. I then made a couple of epoxy balls and I stuck them to the ends of the rope to kind of create the amulet shape. Once satisfied with the shape, I then put it onto Vicar Amelia's hand and I let it sit and cure. Next, we can make the antlers. To do that, I took a piece of epoxy and I rolled it out into a thin line. Then I cut it up using my hobby knife into equal pieces and I tried my best to assemble the antlers without squishing them down as much as I could, especially holding that antler shape. I then carefully attached the antlers to the top of the vicar's head. Then, for the hair, I took the remainder of my green stuff and I rolled it into very fine noodles that I would use later. This ultimately would take up a lot of time and I found it to be a little difficult, so I did the majority of it off screen, but I did make a lot of it. To attach the hair to Vicar Amelia, I used a paintbrush and Elmer's glue. I started at the bottom layer so that I could build up the layers so that the fur kind of looks matted and volumetric like the video game, and I think it worked out pretty well. This was actually my first project that I've ever tried to tackle miniature hair as a topic, so that was kind of interesting for me to try out. Ultimately, this was a first attempt, but I was pretty satisfied with the outcome. Once enough hair had been attached to the model, I then covered up any bald spots with liquid green stuff. I did make the hair a little bit unruly at this step, as that was the reference photo I was working with, but I did change that later on. Once everything had set, I applied a zenithal prime to the entirety of the model. The overall paint scheme for Vicar Amelia is pretty straightforward. A blue-black skin tone with some dry brushed white fur color on top. After that, you include some brown bone color for the antlers. For all of her linen wraps on her arms and face, I put a thin down brown wash and then I cleaned up the details using the black. For the pendant in her hand, I used a brown leather color and a gold amulet color. Once the Vicar has been painted, we can move her aside and start looking at the Book Nook box. In order to fit all the electrical work into this Book Nook, I need to remove the back of the box and replace it with a new one later on. To do this, I took a hobby knife and I just pushed it out with my hand. Then I took some careful measurements and I cut some XPS foam on my hot wire table that will fit the insides of this diorama well. For the floor of the diorama, I want to put this just plug switch onto it, so I'll need to cut a segment of the base off so it will be a little bit more flush with the terrain. Before I proceeded any further in this project, I dry fit all the pieces into the base of the Book Nook just to make sure that I had space. Once I was confident that everything would fit, I then cut out the base where the switch would be, and I made a little hole in the bottom so that the wiring wouldn't bulge underneath the brick terrain. Due to spacing concerns, I ultimately decided to make the walls and the columns half the thickness just so I could fit Vicar in as well. For some visual variety on the walls of the Book Nook, I traced out some windows that I cut out with my hot wire cutter on the walls. Off camera, I also trimmed out some thin strips of XPS foam to serve as a nice windowsill for these windows. To cover the windows up, I used some Woodland Scenics light diffusing window film. To apply these to the windows, I just traced it out around the window and I put it on the outside where it would touch the box. In the boss arena that you fight Vicar Amelia in Bloodborne, it's in this giant stone cathedral. To replicate that stone cathedral, I took a colored pencil and I pushed down on the XPS foam to create a nice texture for all the surfaces. Once I was happy with how all the surfaces were textured, I then applied a black primer from my airbrush to every square inch of the surfaces. Once primed, I applied a dawnstone layer to the entirety of it to give it that stone appearance. For the windowsills, I used the same color as the wall, however, I hand drew them on, being as careful as I could. I was actually pretty satisfied with how these ended up looking. To bring some detail back into the stone texture we created, I'm going to hand trace as thin as possible lines as I can of a contrast paint in between the stone bricks. This ultimately was a pretty successful process, and I think it brought a lot of life to the diorama. Once everything has been painted and dried, we can move to the final assembly, including the electronics. Before the final nails are set in this, we need to make a cover for both the back, the front, and the diorama background. To do this, I traced out sheets of polystyrene that I ended up gluing to the back, front, and midpoint of the Book Nook. For the sheet that will be between the miniature and the electronics, I had to cut out little notches in it so that the wiring could pass through. For the sheet that goes on front, I had to cut out a little viewing port so that we could actually see the book nook. Once all the sheets are ready, we can take them to be painted. For all the exterior faces, they were just hit with a black primer that matched the primer we put to the box in the first step. Finally, for the divider piece of the diorama, I gave it the same treatment as the other surfaces. I applied this Dawnstone primer, hand traced some bricks, and then attached it once it had dried. Once everything had officially set, we can then put the back onto the diorama and move on to some glamour shots. I'd like to take this moment and say thank you to each of you who stayed through to the end of this video. I really enjoy sharing my creative process, and I always enjoy learning new things to try. This is my first diorama with lights, and I'm pretty happy with it. I'll be back soon with another story to tell, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. See you around.